Very well. Good afternoon, everyone in the call today. It is so great to see so many of you in the call. Welcome to Race Talks, an interdisciplinary virtual colloquium series at Texas A&M University. I am Dr. Mariana Garriazzo, and I will be doing a very brief intro, and then passing the mic to Dr. Donnelly Dawes, who will be introducing our keynote speaker for the series, Dr. Feagin. I would like to remind everyone to stay on mute to ensure the best quality of sound throughout the presentation today. Race Talks is made possible by an Advanced Climate Together grant from the College of Liberal Arts, and this series aims to invigorate campus-wide conversations on anti-racist advocacy through pedagogy, performance, and research. This is a collaborative effort across 6 university units, and I would like to send a warm thank you to all participating programs, including African Studies, the dance program, Film Studies, Latino, Latina, and Mexican American Studies program, Performance Studies, and Religious Studies. Thank you are also in order to our wonderful staff who makes it all possible behind the scenes. So thanks to Darlene, Myra, and Kathy for all your help in making Race Talks possible. Our hope it is that this series will bring to campus, albeit virtually, emerging and established BIPOC speakers from many different fields and disciplines. So we will have scholars, managers, administrators, choreographers, dancers, performers, filmmakers, visual artists, all joining faculty, staff, and students at Texas A&M University. I'm going to copy and paste here the website in which you can, I'm going to share it on the chat right there, multitasking. So you can learn more about the series and the upcoming events on that website, on the chat. You can also register for future events. Our next one will take place on February 18th, and it's a panel, a wonderful panel. So I'll invite you to attend that one and register in advance. All these events are free and open to TAMU affiliated students, faculty, and staff. To all of you joining our conversation today, I invite you to demonstrate our true Aggie spirit that will set us apart as a community. Our core values of excellence, integrity, and respect are fully expected in this meeting today and in all interactions for the Race Talks. Talking about how we will be interacting today, let me copy and paste this for you. These are my instructions on how the meeting will proceed today. So notice that we will remain mute throughout the talks, throughout the lecture. And at the end of this lecture, there will be some time for a Q&A. So we will have that at the end. So if you want to ask questions, please write your questions on the chat, and then Dr. Dawes and myself will bring those questions to Dr. Feagin. And also at the end of the event, there will be a survey that I will be providing so the students can complete that survey as part of the grant and the Advanced Climate Together proposal. So thank you so much. And without further ado, Dr. Dawes, would you like to introduce our speaker? Oh, a technical problem right here. Let me change that. Very well. So here you go.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Garriazzo. And welcome to Dr. Feagin and to everyone. And good afternoon. Professor Joe Feagin, Ellen C. McFadden Distinguished Professor, perhaps needs no introduction, and it's difficult to do justice to his influence in a short introduction. Since his foundational 1978 textbook, Racial and Ethnic Relations, now I believe in its 9th or 10th edition, laid open discussions about the what and the why and the how of racial and ethnic oppression and conflict, his more than 70 books and more than 200 articles on social change, sexism, and racism have been a major influence within and beyond the discipline of sociology, within and beyond the United States. His research studies include Subsidizing the Poor, a Boston Housing Experiment, White Racism, The Basics, Discrimination, American Style, Institutional Racism and Sexism, The White Racial Frame, How Black Built America, Double Burden, Black Women and Everyday Racism, and Elite White Men Ruling. And that spans from the early 70s to our current decade. It's an extraordinary range of work. And he is co-editor of the essential reference work in the field, the Handbook of the Sociology of Racial and Ethnic Relations. A Pulitzer nomination, receipt of the Harvard Alumni Association Achievement Award, the Texas NAACP Civil Rights Hero Award, and the Texas A&M College of Education Legacy of Excellence and Equity Research Award, that was just 2 years ago, are only a few of the ways the impact of Dr. Feagin's work has been recognized. He has received numerous awards from the American Sociology Association for his work on racism, and he served as the association's president in 1999 and 2000. His ongoing editorial work, particularly Roman and Littlefield's series Perspectives on a Multiracial America and Rutledge's New Critical Viewpoints on Society, ensures that the pressing issues of racism and sexism we are engaging with in this series remain front and center in discussions of social progress. Perhaps Professor Feagin's tireless research aimed at exposing systemic racism in service of social change is captured in the words of Frederick Douglass, who asserted in 1857 that power concedes nothing without a demand. In Professor Feagin's research, that demand comes from his exposure of the white racial frame, a pervasive worldview that places anyone who is not white outside the frame. Changing that worldview, Professor Feagin argues, requires deframing long-held views and reframing those views through constant, relentless attention to the practices, individual practices, social and political, that structure systemic racism. Professor Feagin's research is living scholarship. And to paraphrase the College of Liberal Arts motto, it is scholarship for life on every level. It requires readers and listeners to examine the social world they live in and to take action within it. And with what is only a short, brief introduction to Dr. Feagin's extraordinary work, I will turn this over to Professor Joe Feagin. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Knox. I like to talk from a handout, and I think it has been passed around, and Mariana can send a few more if you need it. I will put it up on the screen. But if you want a copy, we can get one to you. What I want to do today is talk about the bigger context of the racial events that have been so central to this society, really from the beginning, but certainly the last few months. We've seen Black Lives Matter movements protesting policing and other racism, and we've also seen an insurrection on our Capitol, actually less than a month ago, that was heavily motivated by white supremacist views and white fears of the so-called browning of America. So what I want to do is offer some concepts, some historical material, and some details. Somebody just dropped the screen.
Sorry, I tweaked something and that happened. Dr. Feagin, I'm so sorry. It was myself.
That's all right. What I'd like to do is start with the timeline. And if you want to understand U.S. society and U.S. racism, it is essential to memorize this timeline and embed it into most discussions you get into on racism issues. Most Americans are simply not aware of the depth of systemic racism in this society. You can start the beginning of this society in 1607 with the founding of Jamestown, Virginia. And within 12 years, the Jamestown colonists bought 20 or so Africans off a Dutch flagged pirate ship. And slavery begins. If you put at the other end the current date, which needs to be updated probably on the handout you have, to 2021, that's 414 of our years. More than half of that, we had slavery as a foundational institution. From 1619 to 1865, we were a slavery-based society. We're the only advanced industrialized country for which that is true. And if you count around 1814 as the midpoint of our history, you see slavery did not even end until well past the midpoint. And if you plot that out, the end of slavery will be halfway into our history, well into our future. So about 60% of our 414 years now involved a brutal slavery system. That was followed by a brief Reconstruction period that ended all too soon. And then 22% more of our history involved the near slavery of legal and de jure Jim Crow segregation. So for about 18 of our 20 or so generations, white families have passed along unjust enrichments from this extreme racist system. Over those same 18 generations, Black families mostly had to endure unjust impoverishment and could not pass along resource enrichments under this extreme racist system. Over the last two generations, we still have had much institutionalized racial discrimination that perpetuates these highly unjust racial inheritances. Let's see that. Let me switch. I think I started with the wrong one, but this is the opening of another version. And I'm going to switch back to the one that has been handed out to you. Sorry about that. Okay, second point, note the long societal scope of this foundational and systemic racism with its many aspects and layers. Ignorance of our white racist history is central to this systemic racism's perpetuation. White on Black oppression has been foundational and deeply embedded in our economic, political, and other institutions for about 400 years now. 414 over that long period of time, we've had systemic racism in this society. Okay, can you see that one now? We still live on, about 82% of our history is slavery and Jim Crow. We still live under a highly undemocratic 1787 US Constitution, substantially made undemocratically by elite white slaveholders and their white business allies. For a full picture of our systemically racist reality, you need to add in other oppression, genocidal oppression of Native Americans from the 1600s, by the 1830s and 1850s, exploitative oppression of Mexican Americans and Chinese Americans, and many other groups thereafter. There is much about our racial history that has been hidden from us or only partly revealed. Just two examples of historical illiteracy I could cite are these. It's critical for us to know our racial history if we're going to understand our racial present. And I picked two here. The first is a negative example. George Washington was an authoritarian slaveholder with a view of his slave plantations as a patriarchal family. He was described by one white visitor as speaking harshly to those he enslaved. Quote, he spoke differently as if he had been quite another man or had been in anger. His overseers used tortuous whips. He had the teeth of some of those enslaved yanked from their heads and fitted into his dentures. Washington vigorously punished runaways, as in the case of one sold to the brutal West Indies plantations for running away, a death sentence in effect. Enslaved workers in the Caribbean did not live long. In the case of another runaway, Washington had his agent try to kidnap her in New York City and return her to his plantation. When he became the first US president, the capital was Philadelphia. Southern slaveholders in the new government worried about having the US capital in Free State, Pennsylvania, whose laws mandated freedom for enslaved individuals resident there for 6 months. President Washington, famous in school textbooks for his morality, devised a lying scheme to bypass the Pennsylvania law. He wrote instructions to his secretary to send enslaved servants periodically back to Virginia so they would not meet the 6-month condition. Quote, I wish to have it accomplished under pretext that may deceive both the slaves and the public. Washington suggests for his secretary to send slaves back on an innocent-looking trip to Virginia with Martha. Quote, I request that these sentiments and this advice be known to none but yourself and Mrs. Washington. George Washington was a bold-faced liar. Unsurprisingly, the capital of the democratic US soon relocated to Washington, D.C., away from the cultural centers of Philadelphia and New York, because powerful slaveholders, including Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, worked behind the scenes to ensure the capital was in a slave state area where those enslaved by government officials would stay enslaved under the law. Well, there's much to talk about even in that brief description of his time in Philadelphia and the move of the capital. But it's clear that powerful whites in this country have always been above the law. And note the early white power and privilege demonstrated first in Washington's lying about those enslaved workers he thought, in Philadelphia, and then his work to move the capital to a slave state area, which is what the District of Columbia was, pieced together from 2 slave states. And then there are positive examples in our history that are also little known. And again, to understand contemporary racism and our whole racist history, all of us need to know much more about this racial history. Here's a part that's very important. About 210,000 African Americans served in the Union, that is the US, Army and Navy, during the Civil War. And another 200 to 300,000 served in civilian roles supportive of the US military efforts. A majority of these men and women had been enslaved, but now were fighting for their permanent liberty. During the war's first years, most Northern whites, including President Lincoln, felt that the Union had to be restored and abolition of slavery was not a principal goal. After the general order to recruit Black soldiers belatedly came down in May 1863, and with the help of Black abolitionist Frederick Douglass and white abolitionist George Stearns, large numbers of Black Americans were finally recruited into the US Army and Navy. These courageous soldiers and sailors provided the military strength needed at a time of serious manpower shortage, due in part to Northern whites resisting the new draft law. Tens of thousands of enslaved or formerly enslaved Black men and women also spied for Union forces, destroyed Confederate facilities, or fled plantations to the north. Again, this history is extremely important, and just a few comments about it. The withdrawal of African American labor, most of it enslaved, played a major role in the demise of the Confederacy. Without their abandonment of the Southern economy and large-scale military service, the Union, that is US cause, would likely not have seen victory, a point that Lincoln himself made late in the war. Obviously, without that Union victory, the US would have had a dramatically different subsequent history than that which has taken place. The old cliche in this country is who freed the slaves? Well, to be exact, the slaves freed the slaves. Those 210,000 African Americans who fought in the Army and Navy, the 200 to 300,000 who served in civilian roles, and those in the South who engaged in labor strikes, won the war. Clearly, racial literacy about such matters is the essential first step to progressive racial understandings and racial change. I could go on all day with examples like these two that are rarely ever dealt with in courses except in advanced courses in colleges and universities. A third point I want to get into is systemic racism and its reality today. This discussion is also not very well known. Back in the 1970s, drawing on the Black critical tradition, a number of Black scholars and a few whites like me started using the language of institutional and systemic racism. It's interesting that this has now become a commonplace term, thanks to the Black Lives Matter protest movements. Up until those movements, it was not widely used in this country. Racism is systemic. It's not just a matter of isolated bigots. It's a foundational and systemic reality in this country. And here's a probably too wordy definition, but a comprehensive definition. Systemic racism involves the deep structures and surface structures of racial oppression. It includes a complex array of white anti-others discriminatory practices, the unjustly gained economic and political power of whites, the continuing economic and other resource inequalities along racial lines, the unjust enrichment of whites and unjust impoverishment of racialized others, and the white racial framing created by whites to rationalize white privilege and power over 4 centuries now. So a brief discussion of racial literacy that is needed to understand our current reality of systemic racism. And the basic question is, why do racial inequality and discrimination persist so powerfully today? And I suggest 4 answers here. And I suspect 3 of these are not well known. They're certainly not fully discussed in this country, but they all help explain why racism persists as a fundamental problem for this society. Part of it is that timeline. 82% of our history was extreme racial oppression, and we've only been dealing with undoing that for the last 18% or so, the last 2 generations of 20 generations. And here's something most Americans, especially white Americans, don't really think about or don't know. A major reason that racial inequality and discrimination persists is because large-scale past discrimination becomes present racial inequality. By means of the social reproduction of past unjust enrichment of whites and the social reproduction of past unjust impoverishment of Black Americans and many other Americans of color. Recent research by one of our own PhD students, Jennifer Mueller, in the Southwest here, found huge racial differences in the acquisition and intergenerational transfer of wealth and social capital over 3+ generations of white students compared with students of color. She had a large sample of white students and students of color who examined the recent histories, the last 3, 4, 5 generations of their families. And the white families in this Southwestern sample reported more than 6 times as many transfers of monetary assets across the generations over the last 3 to 5 generations as compared to the families of color. Inheritances of land, homes, and businesses were similarly disproportionate. Why such a huge difference in the social transmission of wealth for white families and the lack of that for families of color? One key part of this is a majority of white families secured significant assets in the past from white affirmative action programs. That is, large-scale government homestead acts, 1860s to the 1930s, and indeed up to about 1970. The Homestead Act was still in effect. Altogether, 240 million acres of farmland was provided under these Homestead Acts, mostly to white families. Now, of course, the side note there is much of that land was taken by force from indigenous Americans. but it was then transmitted to white Americans, creating enormous wealth. For an estimated about 45 million Americans today have benefited just from that one set of programs. 45 million middle-class Americans have ancestors that profited off the Homestead Act. Whites also have profited off major federal housing and veterans programs after World War II, which effectively built the middle class. Mueller's white family histories have 5 times as many instances of these government-derived assets as the families of color. The implications: most U.S. wealth is today in white hands and is regularly passed across the generations. Another term for that is unjust enrichment from that long history of slavery and then Jim Crow. Great racial inequalities persist substantially because most whites insist on keeping those unjust enrichments they or their ancestors secured over centuries of systemic racism. Notice too the great racial illiteracy in this country and ignorance in the white population and others that is exhibited today on these issues. Why do racial inequality and discrimination persist? Because it's been transmitted over those 20 generations. From the first 18 generations, which had this extreme racial exploitation system called slavery and Jim Crow. And then those whites passed along enrichments to later generations to the present day. And people of color, of course, suffered under those first 18 generations of unjust impoverishment. I assume you didn't read about that in high school textbooks. Another reason for this perpetuation of racial inequality and discrimination is because we whites are very clever at maintaining highly racialized, segregated white networks. What social scientists sometimes call social capital reproduction over the generations. These incestuous, segregated white networks that are critical for preserving white wealth, white social superiority. There's a brilliant study by sociologist Nancy D. Tomaso. She conducted recent interviews with 200 whites. And her interviews demonstrate white networking patterns routinely reproduce systemic racial inequalities. Most of those whites in that large sample reported using acquaintances, friends, family to find most of their jobs over their lifetimes. She focuses a major part of her study on our careers and our jobs. And when she did that for these 20 whites, they talked about getting their jobs over their lifetimes, their adult lifetimes, by using white acquaintances, friends, family to find those jobs. Most avoided open market competition, securing jobs using racially segregated networks. That is, they got the jobs not just on merit. She had them go job by job over their lifetimes. And another finding in her study is not one of those 200 whites in their interviews ever expressed concern about what de Tomaso calls opportunity hoarding. And assessment again. Most whites seem to fear that effective affirmative action programs today for long oppressed people of color weaken this institutionalized favoritism for whites. There are two kinds of discrimination. Clearly, there's the direct discrimination that excludes people of color openly or covertly. And then there's a system that is so good at preserving favoritism for whites through white networks of friends and family. And it's really striking that no one in the sample expressed concern about this opportunity hoarding using whites only network. A third reason that this racial inequality persists has to do with the lack of enforcement of our 1964, 65, and 68 Civil Rights Acts. We have only modestly or not at all enforced those acts. They ended official segregation, but allow or create continuing racial inequalities and extensive discrimination. Dozens of recent research studies show high levels of persisting racial discrimination in these areas. And the fourth one that I want to emphasize in the rest of the lecture is the still dominant white racial frame greatly helps to preserve these racial inequalities over the generations. Since the 1600s, a powerful white racial frame has rationalized and legitimated this racist society. It includes these important dimensions: racist stereotypes and prejudices. Unfortunately, most of the discussion in this country about the motivation and generation of racial discrimination stops there. The other word for that is racial bias or racial animus. That is a key part of the white racial frame that legitimates this great racial inequality and motivates racial discrimination, but it's only one part. Another part of the white frame are the racist narratives and myths and interpretations. There are many of those. The claim such as there's widespread reverse racism against whites, or the claim that we're making great racial progress and we don't need aggressive affirmative action or reparations programs, or the argument that whites are the superior and Black folks should be glad they were brought here as enslaved peoples, which I'm still hearing online. So a key part of the white racial frame is these racist narratives that we whites use to interpret our position at the top of the racial hierarchy. There are also racist images in that frame, visual images, and negatively viewed language accents, both positively and negatively viewed language accents. There are racialized emotions. And of course, the frame moves in the direction of inclinations to discriminate. This broad and strong framing has a very positive orientation to whites as virtuous. The center of it is a pro-white virtue subframe. We whites are the most superior in terms of civilization, history, science, scholarship, values, work ethic, female beauty, you name it. Positioned at the center of the white racial frame is these evaluations of things white as highly virtuous. Also in that frame is a set of subframes with a negative orientation to the oppressed racial others, viewed as unvirtuous. And there are many of those anti-others subframes. Black, Indigenous, Latino, Asian, Middle Eastern. There are many anti-others subframes. For most whites, this dominant racial frame is a worldview, way more than a few biases, that provides regular perspectives and orientations in everyday life. And it has motivated large-scale discrimination now for those 20 generations. One note, you don't have to be white to operate out of this dominant white racial frame. It's forced on all Americans, and all Americans are indoctrinated to some extent in this white racial frame. Let me give you two examples of everyday racial performances from two of the many studies my students and I have done now over 40 years. Leslie Haltzbicka and I, one of my graduate students, had 626 white college millennials at 24 colleges keep short diaries on the racial events they saw in their everyday lives. These were for about 6 to 12 weeks, they're brief diaries. Those 626 white college students across the country gave us 7,500 accounts in these brief diaries of clearly racist events. We just asked them to record racial events. They themselves often name them, well, I see these racist events. This is a fairly typical one that is pretty revealing. This is a white female college student at one of our top Midwestern universities. And this is a quote from her diary. She says, 3 of my white friends and I went back to my house to drink a little more before we ended the night. Dylan started telling jokes. What is the most confusing day of the year in Harlem? Answer, Father's Day, who's your daddy? Dylan also referred to Black people as porch monkeys. Everyone laughed a little, but it was obvious that we all felt a little less comfortable when he was telling jokes like that. My friend Dylan is not a racist person. That's interesting. He has more Black friends than I do. That's why I was surprised he so freely said something like that. Dylan would never have said something like that around anyone who was a minority. And then she goes on with some rather interesting reflection. And she's more reflective than almost all the others, 625 students. It is this sort of joking that helps to keep racism alive today. People know the places they have to be politically correct, and most people will be. However, until this sort of behind-the-scenes racism comes to an end, people will always harbor those stereotypical views that are so prevalent in our country. And she continues, this kind of joking really does bother me, but I don't know what to do about it. I know that I should probably stand up and say I feel uncomfortable when my friends tell jokes like that, but I know my friends would just get annoyed with me and say that they obviously don't mean anything by it. Again, there's much going on in this little gathering over drinks, but you can see it's a routine and repeat performance of white racist framing. This isn't a one-time thing. And another thing, it's clear that even she thinks Dylan is not a racist person, even though he's operating aggressively out of an anti-Black part of the white racial frame, with 2 of the more vicious kinds of jokes that whites tell. And we often do this backstage. there's a scholar named Irving Goffman, a Canadian scholar, who did a book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. And he talks about how whites that he was studying in Great Britain perform differently in the backstage on certain issues when they're just home with friends and relatives than they did out in public, and presented themselves differently in those two settings. Without knowing that scholarship, she's making that same kind of contention that behind the scenes racism. Goffman called it backstage racism. But she's making a very insightful commentary that this behind the scenes racism is critical to preserving US racism. Another thing you see in this is certainly she and maybe others know it is morally wrong, but they don't stop if they're doing it, or they don't try to stop it if their friends are doing it. In those 7,500 accounts that those 626 white college students gave us, there are only about 100 accounts of racist performances where any white person in the setting tries to stop it or resist it. Very small percentage of any of these racist accounts recorded by these students have a white person even going so far as telling a girlfriend, telling her boyfriend, "You guys stop it, let's go see a movie." And the number of accounts where the white students are using strategies, anti-racist strategies, is probably about 15. Almost none of these white students have ever had any kind of anti-racism training. Another small study that I did with college graduates basically asked them to record racial events in their everyday lives. So these are somewhat older white Americans. And this is one of the most revealing diary accounts in this set. This is a white college graduate. She's a PhD student in social science. She diaries about a meeting with 5 white college graduates for a sports outing on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday weekend. So there's 6 whites in this room. All of them have college degrees, 3 are MBAs, 2 are doing graduate work, and 1 is a college graduate. So these are our best educated white Americans. And this is a quote from her diary. Quote, "A few of the MBA graduates were expressing their happiness about having a 3-day weekend ahead. One of the male MBA graduates, she calls him Rob, who is now employed at a large corporation earning more than 6 figures per year as a stock trader, was standing at the front of the room. Rob stated, 'Yes, since it is Martin Luther King Day,' and she adds, with a sarcastic tone and smirk on his face, he used his fingers in a quoting motion to emphasize these words, 'Then we get an extra day of sports.' He continued by saying, 'You know, if we killed one of them every day, we could get the whole year off.' At this point, I turned my head to face Rob. A couple of people in the room knew me and were aware of what I study and my anti-racist views. The other 2 male graduates from the MBA program responded to Rob's comment with smiles and boisterous laughing. The other female, and apparently there's another male there, looked toward the floor and remained silent. After the room went quiet again, I responded by saying, "Look, Rob, I would rather you not start with this tonight, okay? I can't believe you'd say something like that. Do you even think about what that means? I don't want to hear it." As I began shaking my head in disgust. Parenthesis, she's been teaching these folks diving off the coast of one of our states. And so she's had repeated contact with them. That's why she's talking like this happens often. "Oh, Judy, it's just a joke," he replied. He continued by saying, "You know, Judy studies these things. She studies race and all that." A little while later, another one of the MBAs said, "Judy, why would you want to study that crap anyway?" A direct quote. Again, you can see much going on here. This is one of those backstage group settings where whites only are present. It's especially interesting that there are kind of 4 behavior types here and just 6 people. There's the protagonist, the Rob, who's pretty wealthy for his age, who apparently loves to tell racist jokes. They're the cheerleaders, the other MBAs, who are cheering him on with boisterous laughing. There are a couple of whites who seem to be passive bystanders looking at the floor. And there's 1 dissenter out of 6. Judy speaking up. And you can see from those previous diaries I talked about that this speaking up is very rare. Notice again in both of these examples that whites do these racist performances, often using joking. And there are many things we could talk about in that regard. You know, why are these things done under the cover of joking? Again, there's much about our systemic white racism that is not discussed, not researched, not taught, and covered up. Both in that historical period with George Washington and those courageous Black Americans who actually played a key role in winning the Civil War, or these kinds of performances that we whites do, both, I guess, in the Trump era, not only in the backstage. Some scholars and analysts have argued that in the Trump era, and probably before, the backstage has moved more into the front stage. That racist joking, white supremacist commentary has become more legitimate in a more diverse front stage setting. But let me stop with just one of my favorite Dr. King quotes. He says, "Justice for Black people will not flow into this society merely from court decisions nor from fountains of political oratory. White America must realize that justice for Black people cannot be achieved without radical changes in the structure of our society. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice." It is the presence of justice. Well, let me stop there and let you ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Feagin. And we do have questions already coming in. So let me start with the first one. You mentioned anti-racist strategies, and this is also a question I was going to ask myself. Can you share some of those with us today? How do whites best respond to other whites' racist talk? And if I could add one little, I think it's a question that follows. What holds people back? What holds whites back from doing the kinds of things that Judy did? What is the fear there? But first, the question, you mentioned anti-racist strategies. Can you share some with us today? How do whites best respond to other whites' racist talk?
Yeah, let that handout, that other handout that I put up there, let's see if I can find it. The one I just talked from, I had shortened. Okay, could you see this section on the other one called Countering the White Racial Frame and Resulting Racist Actions? In that longer version, I answer that question, at least briefly. There are two sets of things we need to do. There's both the group kind of response to racist actions and our systemic racism, and there are individual ones, which I guess is where that question you just asked is more focusing on individuals. But let me mention the first thing we should be doing is teaching an honest racial history, including the George Washington, including the Black soldiers and sailors. We should teach many more, especially whites, young and old, about the dominant white racial frame, its dimensions and how it works. And as a necessary part of that reframing, we need to become very reflective on and learn our actual history of foundational and systemic racism. We need to teach it, learn it, and not just the virtuous white version of it. You know, when I mentioned Francis Scott Key as another example, actually an incredible example. Francis Scott Key, as you know, the author of our national anthem, was a bloody, major, wealthy slaveholder and back to Africa colonizationist. He wrote our national anthem during the War of 1812. He wrote in general terms in that frequently sung anthem about the land of the free, yet he did not mean what he said. For he worked for the new nation to be a slaveholding republic of free white men. There are many examples of that view that he held. So one good anti-racism step is teaching and learning an honest history of this country, including its white founders. Surely we can come up with a national anthem that's written by a true small d Democrat. On the individual issues, there are several good books and websites that get into the individual strategies we can use to counter racism, like the Rob account. And I've got those in this second part here. We need to teach children and adults to develop everyday racism countering strategies. We don't do that much. And we need to start with ourselves. And let's take the Rob example. You can call it out, show that it hurts. You know, if you're in a room with racist whites telling jokes, you can say things like, I know you meant well, but that comment hurts. Or you can use pointed humor. Like, Rob, did you learn that joke from the Klan? Now, even the Robs of the world probably don't want to be identified with the Klan. Or you can show puzzlement if you don't want to be, this is kind of the least confrontational, maybe, just show puzzlement. Can you please explain that comment? Somebody makes a comment about Mexican Americans being lazy workers, or tells a joke about lazy Mexican American workers with a sombrero under a cactus. And just that, can you explain what you mean? Explain that comment? Assertively call it out. People don't like to explain their racist jokes or their racist commentaries. And it kind of foregrounds the racism of it when you do something as gentle as, can you please explain that for me? Or you can reframe the event to accent positive framing. Where children and adults have conflicting frames in their minds, for example, you can highlight the justice and fairness frame versus a white racist frame. Somebody's making a racist commentary, you could say, "What? Do you really think that's fair?" Some comment about Blacks, Latinos, Asians. Activate the positive justice, fairness frame. One good thing about this country is we have a deep liberty and justice for all frame, a deep fairness frame, in addition to the white racist frame. It's just so many of us don't use that fairness, justice frame nearly enough. And another is remind people of their faith or moral values, if that's relevant. Somebody's making a racist joke, racist commentary. You know, most of our religious traditions have some version of we are all God's children, love thy neighbor as thyself. And we, especially whites of all ages, really need to regularly call out racist performances in the backstage and front stage. Obviously, we're the only ones in the backstage. So, and there, at the bottom of this one, there's a really good website that a fellow named Aguilar has. It's called ouchthatstereotypehurts.com. ouchthatstereotypehurts.com. And he has some of these suggestions, others of his suggestions, you know, both mainly for individual responses or small group responses. Very good question.
There is a number of other questions. Here we have one by Dr. David Donkor, and he asked Dr. Feagin, would you say that a good starting anti-racist strategy for us at TAMU is learning an honest history of our institution and some of the unseemly associations of our institution founders? I ask this because that kind of honest history has come under criticism on this campus recently.
So say it again. Is the question asking, should we teach an honest history of our founders, sort of?
That's correct.
Yes, definitely. You know, we've got Soule Ross, who was a Confederate general who believed in fighting for slavery in the most honored statue position on campus. It's time to replace him with someone dedicated to full democracy in this country. And we're not the only ones. There are actually a couple of books now about how Harvard and Yale, many of our top universities were built by enslaved workers, educated slaveholders, and in those days, they were all sons. Princeton, I think, still has a dorm where some of the rooms have a little room off the side where the sons of slaveholders could keep their enslaved servants. Now, many of our universities and colleges have very close connections with key figures in that slavery history and Jim Crow history. And we need to teach those histories. And we have a massive cover-up of our racist history in this country. You know, have you ever seen that diagram at the top? Have you ever heard anybody emphasize that almost all of our history was totalitarianism? We've only been an officially free country since about 1969. That's 52 years of our 414 years. We've been an officially free country. Up until then, we had slavery and Jim Crow. And if you were Black and other people of color, it certainly wasn't a free country. It was not a democratic country. It's not just chance that Adolf Hitler and some of his Nazi associates came to the US and studied our Jim Crow system and used ideas from our Jim Crow system of oppression in devising their plans for Jim Crowing, oppressing Jewish and other Europeans they wanted to suppress and repress and oppress. We don't tell an honest history of Jim Crow. When my dad went to Texas A&M in the 1930s, it was all white, all male, and all military. In a state that had many students of color. And we didn't even begin to desegregate until the 1960s. And again, A&M is by no means alone. History matters.
We do have other questions coming in. How would you critique Thomas Soule's work with your approach? I have not read his book called Black Rednecks and White Liberals, but I have watched his YouTube interview and he points to different sources of systemic social differences. Shelby Steele, another writer who comes to mind, but this question from Peter Walsh asks about Thomas Soule's work. How will you respond to Thomas Soule's work?
I don't know much about Thomas Soule. He's a conservative Black scholar. I would have to read what's being talked about to make an intelligent comment about it.
Dr. Kim Katari in the Department of Performance Studies asks, do you have suggestions for when we teach these concepts? For instance, the continued presence of systemic inequality, but get backlash from students who think this is just our liberal bias. In other words, do you have strategies for reaching those who most need to hear this, but become defensive, the Robs in our classes?
Yeah, I think the best thing is to teach from history. You know, like those, that's why I, played up those two historical accounts. I usually start with those histories. And then talk about concepts like systemic racism. You notice I started with this history. How can anybody deny that we were a racially totalitarian system for most of our history? Is that a liberal bias or a reality bias? Now you can plug into that minorities of whites who fought back against these systems of racial oppression. That's part of this history too. It's actually known a little bit more. Abolitionists are talked about. They tend to be the white abolitionists. But I think teaching the answer to that question is one I've done for 55 years now, is start with the data first, start with the history first. And then this history, I grew up in Jim Crow segregation in Houston. Most of the discussion of Black folks among my relatives and friends was using the N-word. Jim Crow segregation targeted Mexican and Black Houstonians. Segregation was ruthless and rigorous. So I would suggest starting with history. Maybe Francis Scott Key. Maybe we should, Kaepernick and the Black athletes were accused of desecrating the national anthem or the flag when they were really protesting police racism. But maybe we should be protesting the national anthem. Oh, by the way, in the third stanza of the national anthem, Francis Scott Key wishes Black people dead. And he means the Black runaways who'd gone over to British lines in 1812 and fought back against the slaveholding Americans. Fortunately, we don't sing that third stanza very often. History will radicalize you if you really look at the honest history. Does that story, that very serious story of George Washington, raise questions about him? Yeah, he did some good things. But an honest history has to deal with things like that, it seems to me. But my answer to that, it's a long-winded answer, but my answer to that is start with history. And your students can say, well, that's not true. That's fake news. And just show them the data.
Our next question speaks to one more. We have two, actually we have several now coming in, and we have about 10 minutes left to the very end, and several people writing in to say thank you for a compelling lecture. So of the questions that have come in, really interesting ones. One question, let me just summarize the questions and then we can go in the last 10 minutes because they're all very good. About the behaviors changing from backstage to front stage, how does that relate to the fact that recently there was an African-American male in the presidency? And two more somewhat related questions. We cannot deny our own racial totalitarianism, but must also put this within the context of world history. Were there any fair, equitable cultures or countries in the 1800s and 1700s? What kinds of societies and government structures evolved in all of the Spanish colonial territories? And then next question, how do we still maintain our national pride while recognizing our shortcomings? It sounds as if the correct historical teaching penalizes our founders and key figures to the extent that we deny their achievements. So those questions are, I wanted to get to all of them because people are really having excellent thoughts and reflections. Dr. Feagin, I might let you go into those three questions where you want to in the remaining 10 minutes that we have. So, do you want me to read them again?
No, yeah, those are all good questions, and they're broad ones that we would need a lot more time to make sense out of. On the Obama question, clearly there is a dialectic in this country where the most racist forces who don't want to see racial change in this country, such as the folks who attacked the Capitol building a month ago, on the one hand, don't want change to happen. On the other hand, there is a multiracial group of Americans who at least are committed to modest racial change. And we saw it in the Black Lives Matter movement, which is probably the first large-scale movement in American history that had so many anti-racist movement in American history that had so many whites in it, mostly younger whites. But this country has a kind of societal dialectic between people who are fighting to preserve that racist system and people who are willing, at least to some degree, to see change in it. And I think that's what the Obama elections reflected. And then that's what the Trump election reflected, was in many ways an anti-Obama election. Certainly Trump himself seems to be obsessed with Obama. So I think that there is this liberty and justice tradition that's part of this country. And that liberty and justice frame is there. There were founders like Tom Paine, who were very strong, small d Democrats. There were Quakers, free blacks, who pressed for a truly democratic constitution and a much more democratic America. We've got that theme in our history. It has often been suppressed or overwhelmed with this other theme of a white racist frame that's determined to preserve white supremacy, white superiority, white control in the society. And right now we seem to have those two deep realities in the society warring against each other. I never thought I would live to see people sacking the American Capitol. You know, the British tried that in the War of 1812. But you can see we've got a very strong underbelly, whatever metaphor you want to use, that's trying to preserve this racial totalitarian system. And there's strong resistance to any idea of reparations over the course of that history. And reparations are certainly necessary, first for indigenous Americans who were nearly destroyed by the genocidal invasion of Europeans, and then the enslaved Africans who were brought onto those lands to work those stolen lands. We have to face up to this. And the question about, well, are there countries that were better than us? If I heard that one right. Sort of like that at the time we were founded.
Yes, in the 1600s and 1700s, what kinds of societies and government structures evolved, especially in the Spanish colonial territories? And were there any fair, equitable cultures or countries in that time period, 17th and 18th century?
Well, the second great and much more democratic revolution after ours in the Americas was the Haitian Revolution. And Haiti was considerably more democratic revolution, small d, than ours. So, and there's certainly indigenous societies, Native American societies, that were quite democratic in their structures, including indigenous societies in Africa when it was attacked by European colonizers and slavers. And the comparisons are interesting, but they're not central for me. I think we have to solve our own problems. And if racial oppression in our country is, if I'm even halfway accurate here, this extreme racial oppression that passed along great wealth to whites and impoverishment to people of color, we have to solve this problem for ourselves. Do we really mean liberty and justice for all? And then we can worry about other countries, I think, after we fix ours.
And I think that this last question, and we are just about to 3:30, but I think this last question, how do we still maintain our national pride while doing this internal search and looking and recognizing and recognizing our shortcomings? How do we still maintain national pride?
That's actually pretty easy. What we need to do is foreground those Americans who worked so hard to make this a real democracy. Like those black soldiers and sailors who helped Mr. Lincoln win the war. We need to tell those stories prominently. We need to tell the story of Tom Paine, the founder who wrote Common Sense, a pamphlet that, if I remember right, Washington or Madison gave credit to Tom Paine for creating the revolution against Britain. We do have many people and groups in this country who fought for our better angels, right? We need to teach about them, celebrate them, foreground them. That would be my answer to that question.
And I think
there are many people like that. David Walker, for example. If you don't know David Walker, look him up. A young black printer in Boston who wrote the first critical analysis of our Declaration of Independence for being hypocritical. All men are created equal. David Walker, a young black printer, said Jefferson was hypocritical. He critiques it, but almost nobody knows David Walker. He's got a document called An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, which is a truly democratic Declaration of Independence, because it includes the 20% of the population that was enslaved at that time. So I would foreground and highlight the positive stories. We can be very proud of that tradition.
Professor Feagin, thank you. We're just about at 3:30, and we've ended on a reminder that history is in a conversation with itself, and it's dialectical, and those histories run parallel. Thank you. Dr. Gariazzo, would you like to close our session?
Absolutely. If I remember to unmute myself, and I've been playing here with the pins and the views and all of that, entertaining myself, trying to catch up with the chat. This has been such a lovely afternoon, Dr. Feagin. this is truly a historical moment for us to be listening to you, and the history you share with us is so impactful. Thank you to everyone that joined us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Feagin, Dr. Dogs, and everyone else who participated today, for joining the meeting and this important conversation. Truly, I would spend another hour and a half listening to you, Dr. Feagin, speaking about all of this. For me, it's so, the word is educational. It really is educational. As an immigrant myself, this has been a true blessing. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. I'm sure that many of us in the meeting will be delighted to read your books and to follow up. You are very active on YouTube and you have many talks there. So may all of us continue to listen to your inspiration and your thought-provoking lectures and commentaries. And thanks all for participating today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, and we'll be in touch. Then, thank you.
Take care.
You too.
Thank you, Dr. Feagin.